Hi, this is Mrs. Rodriguez with Solving Inequalities with Negatives. So for our warm-up today, it says select the expression equivalent to negative 2x plus 8.1y minus a negative 9x plus 5.3y. And then we have the choices of A, B, C, or D. So you will notice that it says select the expression. It's not plural. It doesn't say select all, so that means there's only going to be one answer. Okay, so let's write that down. So there's only going to be one answer. Now, we also need to remember that equivalent means equal to. So this question is saying select one of these that is equal to the negative 2x plus 8.1y minus negative 9x plus 5.3y. The other thing we need to remember is what do we actually do when we're subtracting? And you need, and if you recall, when we're subtracting, we're actually adding the opposite. So let's go ahead and do that. We have negative 2x plus 8.1y, and we're going to add the opposite. So it's going to be plus, the opposite of negative 9x is a positive 9x, plus the opposite of a positive 5.3 is going to be a negative 5.3y. All right, now we need to combine like terms. Remember, x's go with x's, y's go with y's, okay? So if I have negative 2x and positive 9x, that's going to give me a positive 7x. Now, if you're still having issues with adding and subtracting your positive and negative numbers, remember, you can always draw a number line, okay? 1, 2, here's my negative 2, here's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. I'm going to go ahead and label those. And now I'm going to start at the negative 2, and I'm adding a positive 9. So I'm going to start here, and now I'm just going to count to the right 9. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And our answer is a positive 7. So remember, draw your number line and count that way if you're still struggling with your positive and negative numbers. Now I have 8.1 and negative 5.3. So let's do that over here. I have 8.1 and I'm subtracting 5.3. I need to borrow from the 8 and that becomes a 7. The 1 now becomes an 11. 11 minus 3 is 8. 7 minus 5 is 2, and I get plus 2.8y. Okay? So now that I've combined the like terms, I can look at A, B, and C and see which one is the correct answer, and it is D. 7x plus 2.8y. Okay? All right, moving on to today's lesson. So today we're covering what happens when we're solving inequalities and we have negatives involved. More specifically, we're multiplying or dividing by negatives. So here we go. Inequalities can be solved just like an equation, but with a few exceptions, meaning we solve them the same, there's just a couple of differences. The goal when solving an inequality is to isolate the variable. That means to get x or y or whatever your variable is by itself. Isolate the variable by using the inverse or opposite operation. The inequality must be balanced. That's why we draw our river. Whatever we do to one side, we have to do the other. And when you multiply or divide by a negative, this is the important part for today. When you multiply or divide by a negative number, the inequality sign is flipped. Okay? So this is the new stuff for today. So once again, inequalities sometimes involve negative numbers. Remember, when multiplying or dividing by a negative, be sure to flip the sign. So once again, let's highlight this. When you multiply or divide by a negative, you flip the sign. Let's put little stars around it. draw a line under it. This is important, okay? Now, before I go into how you flip the sign, I want to explain why we need to flip the sign, okay? There's a reason why we flip the sign when we're dividing or multiplying by a negative. So I'm going to show you two examples. My first example, let's say I have the number 2 and the number 5. We can all agree that 2 is smaller than 5, right? So let's see what happens if I multiply both numbers by a negative. So I'm going to multiply the 2 by a -1, and I'm going to multiply the 5 by a -1. Well, negative times a positive equals a negative, so both answers are going to be negative. And 1 times 2 is 2, so it's going to be a -2 is less than 5 times -1, which is -5. Now, is -2 less than -5? No, -2 is bigger than -5. So that sign is no longer true and it's not valid. This is why we have to change the sign. Because when you multiply by a negative, it changes which number ends up being the bigger number. Okay? So we need to make sure we change and flip the sign. All right, let's try one where we're dividing. Let's say I have 12 and 18. Well, we can agree that 12 is less than 18 or smaller than the number 18. Now let's see what happens when we divide by a negative. So I'm going to divide both sides by a -6. Okay? A positive divided by a negative is a negative, and 12 divided by -6 ends up being -2. And 18 divided by a -6 equals -3. All right, so then we end up with -2 is less than -3, which is not true. -2 is larger than -3. So the sign's no longer valid. This is no longer true. So we have to go ahead and flip it. Okay? So that's why when we multiply or divide, we have to flip that sign, because when you multiply by a negative, it changes in your answer which number ends up being the bigger number. So if you don't flip it, it's no longer valid and it's incorrect. All right? Now, let's try to do some examples. Before we go into one with a negative, let's go ahead and just review one, a regular one that's just positives. So, step 1, draw the river. Step 2, opposite operation. So I'm going to divide both sides by 4 because it's 4 times k, so the opposite would be 4 divided by 4. And we get k is less than or equal to 5.5. Okay? So, that's my solution. And we can go ahead and check our answer. Now, if k is less than or equal to 5.5, that means we can choose any number that's smaller than or equal to 5.5. And we want something to be easy, so I'm going to make it k equals 0, because why not? We now plug it into the original equation, and we get 4 times 0 is less than or equal to 22. Well, 4 times 0 is 0, and 0 is definitely less than 22, so we did it correctly. Now we can graph our solution. So, I'm going to do a couple of numbers bigger, a couple of numbers smaller. 5.5 is going to be halfway between 5 and 6. We have, oopsie, dropped my pen. We have the or equal sign also there, so that means our bubble is going to be filled in, not empty. And k is the numbers smaller than or equal to, so my arrow is going to go towards the numbers smaller than or equal to. All right, let's look at number 2. Step 1, we draw the river. Now we have s divided by a -2. So the opposite of division would be multiplication, so I'm going to multiply both sides by -2. Okay, these cancel out and I get s. Now because we multiplied by a negative, we know that negative is going to change our answers and which one's bigger and smaller. So we need to flip the sign. And then a positive times a negative is a negative, and 5 times 2 is 10. And we get S is less than negative 10. So if S is less than negative 10, and we could choose any number smaller than 10, because we're going to pop it back into the original equation, it needs to divide by 2. I want to choose something that's easy to divide by 2. So let's go ahead and choose negative 12, because negative 12 is smaller than negative 10. Well, that means we have negative 12 divided by negative 2 is greater than 5. A negative divided by a negative is a positive, and 12 divided by 2 is 6. And 6 is definitely larger than 5. So we did it correctly. Also, keep in mind, if we hadn't flipped the sign, what would happen is it would say 6 is less than 5. And that would be a huge red flag that something's wrong, and in this case, we didn't flip the sign. Okay, so that's another way to tell if you forget to flip the sign, by checking your answer. Now we're ready to graph the solution. We have S is less than negative 10. So I'm going to choose 2 numbers that are bigger, 2 numbers that are smaller to graph this. I put the bubble on negative 10. It stays empty because there's no or equal sign attached to that symbol. It's just less than. And S is all the numbers smaller, so my arrow is going to go towards all the numbers smaller. All right, so the only difference today is if you multiply or divide by a negative, you need to remember to flip that sign. Other than that, it's the same thing as when we were just doing solving regular one-step inequalities. All right, for number 1 through 6, I want to go over a special case really quick before I have you try some on your own. So let's take a look at number 3. Now, you'll notice for number 3 that we have a C that's negative, but there's no number in front of it. And it's kind of like, okay, what's going on with that? So the thing we need to keep in mind is anytime you have a negative variable like negative C, that actually means it's a negative 1 times the variable, okay? And if it helps you, you can go ahead and draw a 1 next to the variable to remind you. Now we just solve it like normal. So I'm going to draw my river. It's negative 1C divided by 2. So I'm going to multiply the 2, which would be the opposite. The 2's cancel out, and I get negative C is less than or equal to. Remember, that sign does not flip because we did not divide by a negative. That 2 is a positive, so we're not flipping the sign yet. So we have 7.5 times 2, which is going to be a negative 1.5. Now, remember there's that 1 in front of it. If that's negative 1 times C, to get C by itself, we still do the opposite. So the opposite of multiplication is division. So I'm going to divide both sides by negative 1. These negative 1's cancel. And I have a C. Because I'm dividing by a negative, guys, now I'm dividing by a negative, I have to flip that sign, and negative divided by a negative is a positive, 1.5 divided by 1 is 1.5, and that's our answer. So you will notice on number 4, we have a negative x. So remember, you just have to remember that that negative x actually means negative 1 times x. And you're going to divide by that negative 1 at the very end, okay? So I want you to do problems 1, 2, 4, 5, and 6 on your own. Pause the video, and when you're ready to check your answers, restart the video and see if you got it correct, okay? Go ahead and pause the video now. All right, welcome back. Let's see how we did on these problems. So draw the river. I'm going to divide by a negative 9. These cancel out. Because I divided by a negative, my sign flips. Negative divided by a negative is a positive. 81 divided by 9 is 9. Number 2, draw the river. Negative 2.5 times D. The opposite would be to divide by negative 2.5. They cancel out. And I get D. Now we divide it by a negative, so the sign has to flip. So D is less than or equal to 30 divided by negative 2.5. A positive divided by a negative is negative. And 30 divided by 2.5 is 12. So we get D is less than or equal to negative 12. For 4, draw the river. The opposite of subtraction is addition. And we get negative x is greater than negative 5. We didn't divide or multiply by a negative, so the sign does not flip. Now I have negative x is greater than negative 5. To get that x by itself, we have to remember that's a negative 1 times the x. So we have to do the opposite and divide both sides by negative 1. They cancel out. Now that we're dividing by a negative, the sign flips, and 5 divided by 1 is 5. Negative divided by a negative is a positive, so you get positive 5. For number 5, draw the river. If there's no symbol in front of a number, that means automatically that it's positive. So the opposite would be to subtract it. We didn't divide or multiply by a negative, so the sign does not flip. And we get negative 7 minus negative 18, which is negative 25. Okay, and for 6, we draw the river. We subtract 3/4. These cancel out, and we get H. We did not multiply or divide by a negative, so the sign does not flip, and you should have ended up with 1 1/2. Pat yourself on the back if you got those correct. All right, moving on. So now we have 1 through 9. For 1 through 9, you're just continuing practicing solving. There's going to be a mix of regular inequalities and ones where you have to flip the sign, so be careful. And go ahead and pause the video. Try to do these on your own. And then when you're ready to check your answers, go ahead and restart the video. And then once you're done solving them, you're going to go ahead and graph your answers. Okay, so go ahead and pause the video now. All right, welcome back. So for the first one, you should have gotten A is greater than negative 10. So my bubble goes on the negative 10, and the arrow goes to the right. For number 2, A is less than negative 10. We did not divide by a negative, so the sign did not change. And the bubble still goes on the 10, except now the arrow goes in the opposite direction. For number 3, A is greater than 10. So I'm going to go ahead and put my bubble on the 10 and the arrow going to the right. For number 4, A is less than negative 5. So I'm going to put my bubble on the negative 5 and the arrow is going to go to the right. For number 5, A is greater than negative 5. So once again, the bubble goes on the negative 5, except this time the arrow goes in the opposite direction. For number 6, A is less than positive 5. For number 7, P is less than or equal to a negative 8. So the bubble goes on the negative 8. Because we have the equal sign also, the bubble's filled in and the arrow goes to the right. For number 8, P is greater than or equal to negative 8. So we're on negative 8 again. The bubble's still filled in because it has the or equal to involved, and the arrow goes in the opposite direction. And last but not least, for number 9, we get P is less than or equal to positive 8. We put the bubble, fill it in, and the arrow goes to the right. Now, if you struggled with this, the main thing that you needed to remember was how to multiply and divide by negatives. So you need to remember that when you have a positive times a positive, it equals a positive. A negative times a negative equals a positive, right? So if the signs are the same, the answer is positive. But if the signs are different, If you have a positive times a negative or a negative times a positive, they equal negatives, okay? And remember, same rules for division, all right? Okay, so let's see. Oops. All right, so the next 2 pages in your packet is homework. You're gonna do problems 1 through 24. You're gonna solve the problems and then graph them on the number lines provided. Remember, if you multiply or divide by a negative, you need to flip the sign, okay? And as always, if you have any questions, if you're still confused or need more help, you can always ask me during class or make an appointment to see me during office hours. I hope you have a great day. Bye.